Hello and welcome to our Liberty Alert Live. I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty. And Facebook did some changes on us, so we're again trying to make sure that everything is copacetic. And we're also going to be changing how we produce this because I'm going to be back on the road. I'm coming to see a lot of you, talking about our Champions for Liberty weekends and the like. And we're going to be doing those things starting already this September and October. So I'm looking forward to being with a lot of you. And some of the things we're going to do will have to be done on the road. So we are going to be doing that kind of thing going forward. Again, it's great to be here with you today. Our Liberty Alert is: should Christianity be illegal, or should it at least be legally private? And I know that's very provocative, but that's kind of what we're talking about today. If you understand the politics of what's going on, that is the question. You know, in some of the debates that and some of the things I'm reading from a cultural standpoint and a political standpoint, people are talking about Christianity as a threat, to our civilization and to our culture. And I'm kind of going, what? From my point of view, Christianity has been a tremendous foundation to a culture that is still striving for freedom and justice for all people, fairly before the law. Should the government be secular or amoral? Isn't that what the separation of church and state is all about? Or, and this is kind of, I'm already kind of giving away where I think we're going to go with this, but isn't American life about relentlessly limiting the government and expanding virtuous citizenship? And if that's the case, then how can Christians help? So thanks again for those of you who have emailed. I've gotten some emails. And by the way, I think one of the emails people have been saying to me is, hey, Pastor, how do we talk about politics? How do we talk about these things moving forward? It's obviously so contentious today. What do we do? How do we do it? So next week, I think I'm going to talk about how to talk about politics with your family, with your friends, and with your neighbors. If you'd like. I do think we have to engage some of these questions, but it doesn't have to always be political. But I'll give you some helpful hints, helpful thoughts, a helpful perspective on how to do that, and maybe even some advice that can help it be a fruitful conversation of persuasion. Or if you cannot agree, then at least you understand why you disagree. And I think that's sometimes very important too. So keep sending me your questions. I appreciate that. Please, if you would, let people know about our website, lcrlfreedom.org, lcrlfreedom.org. We've got all kinds of resources there for people. And again, we're just not getting that word out. So I really would appreciate it if you tell 10 friends and 20 friends and just let people know that exists for them. And for those of you who are moved by it, if you're able to give to us in this difficult time, we sure would appreciate it. We exist only by the grace and the gracious giving of people all around the country. We're not in anybody's budget. So again, if you feel compelled, there's a button on our webpage, or there's a button on our Facebook page as well. All right, let's get to it today. Let's go back and look at the week in review. There's all kinds of issues going on. We can't focus on all of them all the time because we spend about 35-40 minutes together. But just a couple of good things. First of all, an article in the New York Post: 94% of Americans who died from COVID-19 had contributing conditions. So the point is that the disease, if you will, of COVID-19 wasn't the predominant reason why they passed away. Now, that is kind of good news. That doesn't in any way take away the hurt and the pain of those who have passed away. But there's a sense we're all getting so hysterical about, even if we contract this disease. I think there was a quarterback in the NFL who said, well, if I die, I die. And I'm thinking, why would he say that? Chances of that guy dying if he gets COVID-19 are so infinitesimal. It's bizarre to have this kind of morbid view of it. Well, we've been kind of conditioned to think that now. We've been conditioned that if you get it, you will die. And it's just not true. And so it doesn't mitigate the mercy and the care and the concern we have for those who have died or those who are really struggling with the illness. But to shut the whole country down and almost commit cultural suicide, it doesn't seem to make sense whatsoever. So the first thing as Christians is we can help with the hysteria and things like that. We don't have to have this, well, if I die attitude. No, let's live. Let's learn, to be a Christian is to have faith and to live life boldly, whether there's going to be a vaccine or not. That's the point. It's a whole different way of living. And just because we get a vaccine for this, there's probably going to be something else we're going to have to deal with. And we're going to live differently than just, well, if we don't get a vaccine, our life's over with. Now, my biggest concern about this hysteria stuff is still not about whether we get a vaccine or something like that. It's about how we live life. And the biggest problem I have is that this isn't even about just can we worship? Is it legal to worship? This is a First Amendment crisis about whether or not the church truly is an essential voice in our culture. Now, it doesn't mean that the culture has to believe that everyone to a person. But our First Amendment says the church is an essential voice in culture, and this crisis is trying to disprove that or to change that notion. And I'm telling you, body of Christ, it's not just about fighting to worship in public and in the flesh. No, it's about being the body of Christ and fleshing the gospel and fleshing his love and forgiveness to a world that is hell-bent on its own destruction and has no answer for that. It's about refusing to be labeled non-essential for those we love and for those, even for those whom we don't necessarily love, or for those who don't love us, if you will. I think about it this way. The last voice in my life is not going to be a secular doctor or a secular nurse or non-believing nurse who says, well, that's all we can do for this person. No, it's going to be a believer's comforting word of hope from a pastor, a spouse, a friend. And if those friends happen to be, those believing friends happen to be doctors and nurses, even better. I still love Luther's view of how to deal with the plague. He said, if you have faith to stay and serve others, even if it costs you your life, or even if you can't deal with that level of fear, then have faith to be able to leave and come back for another day. It's all about faith. It's about faith living life boldly in this sinful, broken world. And the state does not define love and care. That's what this is about. That's what we're fighting for. The church is an essential voice in the midst of this, at least for those of us who are believers, and we will not be reclassified in our culture. So some good news. This hysteria is something, we don't have to be hysterical about this. We can be concerned, and we can have a view of how to approach these things. The second one, I think, it's excellent news again. We're called, and this is a policy thing that's going on, and there's in the Wall Street Journal, Heather McDonald had an opinion piece, and Heather McDonald, the war against police, she's the diversity delusion. She's a sociologist who, again, wanted to be beneficial to the urban challenges. She really wanted to make a difference. So she started doing the research. She started getting the facts of things, and she wrote an opinion piece that's called "The Myth of Systemic Police Racism." It is a myth, and if we're going to speak the truth in love, there's two kind of versions. Well, the Bible's version is speak God's truth, the biblical truth in love, okay? So we're compelled to speak his moral, his law, and his gospel on God's terms. That's what that verse means. But it also challenges us to speak about things that we know are true, even in kind of the worldly sense as well. We better investigate what we're speaking about. And if we don't know what we're talking about, then we should have this Reformation restraint that seeks the truth. We should be listening first and investigating first, and then finally speaking when we know it's true. And she talks about the actual numbers, and I'm not going to be able to read all of this for you, but she talks about, I didn't know this. Did you know that police basically have 375 million annual contacts with the people in culture? 375 million contacts. That's a lot. And so basically, she said in 2019, police officers fatally shot 1,000 people out of that 375 million, and a quarter of them were African Americans, were black. And then she said, now that actually is kind of shocking compared to the fact that the offenders, most criminal offenders, 53% of known homicide offenders, 60% of robberies are African American men, even though they're less than 13% of the population. So the numbers right there don't suggest systemic racism. And then she talked about how unarmed people shot. It was 9 unarmed black people and 19 unarmed whites in 2019. So think about this. 9. And then there's in 2018, there were 7,400 black homicide victims. And so again, by the time she goes through the numbers, she said there's nothing showing that there's a systemic problem that needs to be, where the police need to be overhauled. And so again, what we're saying is, look, we don't have a problem with this limit the police stuff, or make sure that the police are doing only the job we're asking them to do. So in that sense, we're supportive of some critical look at how armed force is used. But to then just willy-nilly say it's the whole system is systemically racist, and then you look at the numbers, you got to know the truth of this stuff. So if we tell police to stand down, then again, we've talked about how then we as virtuous citizens need to stand up. Well, if the police stand down and violence ensues, then we got a real problem, and that's where we are with a lot of these things. So again, I just remember when I lived in New York City, we found out, when Giuliani was mayor, we found out that that a lot of the deadly stuff that was happening, that was causing all people, black, white, and every ethnicity in between, causing us all to be afraid of each other. It was just a handful of perpetrators. And it's called the broken glass theory. And when they went after those perpetrators, even on low-level crime, they found out that they were the ones committing some of the egregious crimes too. Once they were taken off the streets, the whole city came alive again, because most people weren't out to hurt each other. They weren't out to rob and to kill each other. Most people just wanted to live peacefully together with each other. So again, there's all kinds of things that need to be talked about with the structural things, with criminal justice reform and things like that. But to just willy-nilly speak with no facts, come on. We need to start with truths. And George Floyd is a truth, too, that we need to deal with. But when you put those things together, we can have a dialogue about this stuff that is beneficial. So let's be a part of that dialogue going forward as church people. And then finally, by the way, when we talk, this is something that'll shock you a little bit, okay? And the only reason I bring it up is because it proves something I've been talking about. There's a guy, his name is Richard Spencer, and if you know that name, it's probably because CNN and the mainstream media and all these different people, they talked about him relentlessly, because evidently he was the organizer and the main voice behind what happened in Charlottesville. And of course, they tried to connect him with either conservatives or with Donald Trump or whatever, on and on and on, because it's this relentless caricature of the opposing point of view. And he's a white supremacist, there's no doubt about it. But remember what I've been talking about, supremacy, white supremacy that did exist in our culture, and it definitely existed in a political part of our culture. It was built on the notion, it was built on a Darwinian notion, it was built on a secular progressive notion, and if they even used biblical terminology, it was kind of redefined through Enlightenment thinking. And of course, 100 and some years ago, they thought, well, white folks are if it's survival of the fittest, they assume that these white folks were on the top, since we're the ones who came up with that ideology, Darwinism. And then you had Planned Parenthood, and you had Margaret Sanger, and all of that was eugenics, and it's supposed to put our biology to work so we could come up with the survival of the fittest and master race and all that nonsense. I've said that supremacy still exists today, and it's alive and well in our universities all over the country, and even our politics, but it now has a diversity face to it. Still Darwinistic, still Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood just got rid of Margaret Sanger because she was an embarrassment to them, but their ideology is still the same. They still want to wipe out those who they think are low-level part of our species. and they don't have any problem doing that, okay? And there's still this notion that some of us are more enlightened than others. And so again, this idea of secular pietism, secular progressivism, it's Darwinian, it's Planned Parenthood, it's just got a diverse face now, and there's always going to be the elites, the ones who are the top of the heap, and then the rest of us. We're fighting against all of that. And here's the kicker. Richard Spencer just came out and endorsed Biden and Harris. But that shouldn't surprise you. He's just a white version of their secular supremacy point of view. He does not believe that all people are created equal. We do. And we believe that because God is the one who gives us inalienable rights. He doesn't believe that. He even said it. He says, no, not everybody's equal. We all have different, some of us are smarter than others. That's how he thinks, but he doesn't believe in inherent dignity. And again, neither did Darwin, neither does Margaret Sanger. So it shouldn't surprise you that even though he doesn't buy into the diversity version of it, he's still a secular progressive deep down, and they all are kind of part of the same, they're different sides of the same coin. So keep that in mind, which is one of the reasons why I get really irritated. Why can't this demonization of our point of view? If we're conservative and constitutional, we believe in everybody's inherent dignity. We believe in equal justice under the law. We believe in equal access, which is why we fight for parental choice in education, all kinds of things. And yet people like Vice President Mike Pence are being the student body demanded that his invitation to be the commencement speaker at Wisconsin Lutheran College be rescinded, and they did. Shame on you, Wisconsin Lutheran College. I checked it out. 90 of the top 100 schools who had commencement speakers, only one was of a conservative, constitutional perspective. The other, I don't know if it was all, I don't even think they had 99 speakers, but they were all of kind of the secular progressive type. When are we going to get over this? When are we going to say stop with the demonization, stop with this caricaturing of people like Vice President Pence? I've met him. I've listened to him several times. He may not agree with his politics, but he is a worthy person to speak at Wisconsin Lutheran University. Golly. So again, this caricature stuff, it's got to stop. This demonization has got to stop. Even with the George Floyd thing, there's a lot of us who believe that was over the top. It should not happen, and there should be a response. But we don't believe in the Marxist, anti-family, sexual orientation response of Black Lives Matter, Inc. But it's either or. No, and quit with the demonization of those of us who really want what's best for all of us, but just have a different point of view. That's where we are with a lot of this stuff. So anyway, that leads us into our discussion, which is, should Christianity be illegal, or at least private? Is it such a threat? Well, let me start off again with that quote from Robert Reich, and I guess I have to explain who he is now because people have forgotten who he is. Robert Reich is the former labor secretary of Bill Clinton, and he's a pretty generic spokesman for what I would call the secular progressive left in our country. And this is, again, what he said. He said this, not me, okay? And I think this embodies the discussion because I've done a lot of reading on this kind of stuff. He said the true battle of the 21st century will be between the modern society and the anti-modernists. Who does he think we are? We're the anti-modernists. Between those who believe in the primacy of the individual and those who believe that human beings owe their allegiance to an identity to a higher authority. Did you notice what he just did? He pitted us against one of our greatest success stories because we believe, because God created you, that you have inalienable rights and the government cannot take those rights away. So the concept of the individual citizen and their rights comes from the notion of believing in the primacy of our identity to a higher authority. Isn't it interesting how he steals that and then he blames us for being anti-modernists? Between those who give priority to life in this world and those who believe human life is a mere preparation for the existence beyond life, that's so silly. I won't even address it. Those of us who believe in the eternality of life believe this life really, really, really matters. Between those who believe in science, reason, and logic, and those who believe truth is revealed through Scripture and religious dogma. Hate to tell them, but the Christian worldview provided the intellectual presuppositions that allowed modern science to actually thrive. That quote just irritates me to no end, because it goes undefended in our public dialogue. But what really gets me is when he says this: terrorism will disrupt and destroy lives, but it is not the greatest danger we face. So he just, in my mind, what did he just do? He said there is no compromise. This is a battle, and one side must win. He said it, not me. And if you don't understand what's behind the politics, we tend to be the kind of people who say, well, isn't politics about dialogue and compromise? Yeah, especially when you think that government has a limited role in your life. But when you think government has an overarching role that even defines your rights and privileges and defines who you are as a person, defines life and death, defines love, defines relationships, and then you say the war is against those guys because they have a different worldview than we do. That's where we're at politically today. This is not about compromise. We are being beaten to the punch, if you will, in so many places, to the point where the side that's coming after us politically, coming after the Christian worldview, I mean, is saying you don't have a right to exist in the public realm of this country. That is actually happening. There's a book by Janet Folger. It was written now almost 18 years ago, 17 years ago. Wow. Called The Criminalization of Christianity. I read that. Oh, by the way, there's another book for those of you who are saying we want more information about socialism. There's a good book called The United States of Socialism by Dinesh D'Souza. I think it's an excellent read about, the big issue for us with socialism, again, is that it fails to take into account basic human anthropology, the dignity and the depravity of humanity. If you don't take into that account the realism of humanity, then and you structure humanity socialistically, assuming that the structure, once it's perfect, good people will just be good to each other. That's why there's so many tyrants who are socialistic, because once they get in charge, fear is their great motivator, not benevolence, not love, not mercy. And so because the human heart is bent towards self-interest. And so the question, if you set up a structure, is how do you mitigate self-interest the best? How do you actually put its worst tendencies to rest, or keep them at bay, and allow whatever good tendencies exist in us as human beings to actually thrive? So there's a great book by Dinesh D'Souza that I think will help you with that. But again, back to what we're talking about, the criminalization of Christianity. When I say that today, people say, no, that can't be happening in America. Come on. And that's why we're in D.C. We're not in D.C. to legislate Christianity. We're generally in D.C. to push back on the state encroachment into every aspect of our life, especially our lives as people in our relationships, our lives as people in our in the religious expression of what matters to us. We're pushing back because basically they're in our business in ways they've never been in our business. Can you imagine the state telling you how to virtuously raise your children? Can you imagine the state telling you how to virtuously educate your children? Can you imagine that? We would have never imagined that 50 years ago, but that's where we are today. Through the education system, through various agencies where the church and the state kind of get into it with each other, adoption agencies, preschools. That's why I was always against universal preschool, because that's just another place where the state takes over and then says, this is what you're going to do with those children. I don't want them to take over. I want equal access to that, but I don't want them telling us what to do. But this is already happening in our country. So in this book, I just started pulling out some things she referenced. Now, I hate to tell you this, but in this book, she was saying this could happen. Pretty much everything she said could happen has happened. And so that's what we're talking about today. And at the very end of our discussion, I want to talk about what we can do, or at least, who we are in view of all this. In 1990 already, in Omaha, Nebraska, a student was prohibited from reading his Bible silently during his free time in school. He wasn't allowed to even open his Bible in schools. Gerke versus Blotzer, 1989. It was then ruled even unconstitutional for a classroom library to contain books that dealt with Christianity, or for a teacher that was seen with a personal copy of the Bible. Yikes. Then things like ethnic intimidation. These laws are coming. The hate laws, hate crime laws, these are bad laws. The state is not in the business of determining the legality of your thoughts. Uh, it's about regulating your behavior and saying you can't do that. Okay? If you got hate in your heart, I feel very sad for you because God's gonna judge that eventually. But the question for a society is if that guy's a jerk, okay, if he minds his own business and stays out of everybody's business, he's a jerk. The minute he takes action that we deem to be wrong, that's when the state gets involved. But to start saying, well, how about we regulate his thoughts before he takes action? That's a very dangerous thing because, first of all, you're giving that kind of process into the hands of fellow sinners who have just as destructive thoughts as the people they supposedly are regulating. That's one of the reasons our founding fathers wanted to limit the government. They knew what the government would do once it had unbound power to do whatever they thought about their supposed constituency. Ethnic intimidation. This happened several years ago when several people were counter protesting, if you will. It was a gay rights parade or something like that, and they were arrested because there was a thing called ethnic intimidation laws and hate crimes. And what happened was they were eventually charged because the hate crimes kind of legislation in the state of Pennsylvania plus this ethnic intimidation law allowed them to be charged as for felonies, because what happened was they said first they were charged with these hate crimes, and then since several of them were together, it was a conspiracy, and suddenly there were 8 different charges, 3 of them felonies, just for trying to share the gospel. And then again, there's all kinds of stuff we could talk about with hate crime legislation, which if you put that into place, the people that are advocating that, they're really using hate crime legislation to mask what they're trying to do. They want to make certain ethical viewpoints criminal in America, certain moral viewpoints criminal in America. So this is what the cultural battle is. This is what it is right now, and it's worse behind the scenes because some of these laws are coming up through the pipeline right now. First, we had Roe v. Wade, where suddenly overnight, one side was actually considered constitutional and the other was considered unconstitutional. But we as Christians were allowed to dissent. We were allowed to say, we don't believe killing kids in the womb is good. We teach against that for those of us who are believers. The pro-life movement has done a tremendous job of changing the questions, not letting the culture define the issue. Last year was the last couple of times. Pro-life is pro-science. How many of you knew that? It's pro-science to believe that is a child in the womb. It is not. The pro-choice, supposedly the pro-abortion people are the most anti-scientific people of all. They've got this kind of quasi, what does it mean to be a person? And so if I don't think the person, that child in development is a person in the womb because they don't have rights yet, because they're not born yet, well, then I can kill them. That's how they argue. Well, that's not scientific. That's sociological gobbledygook. But to say that they're scientific, no, absolutely not. So again, as we think about how they changed the dynamics of the discussion, they changed the verbiage, and a lot of people are starting to say, you know what? Those pro-life people, they really believe in the sanctity of life for all people. It's a great thing. But now Obergefell and Bostock, which is the homosexual marriage ruling, and then, of course, the sexual orientation ruling, we're not allowed to dissent. And there's legislation coming up now. One's called Fairness for All Act that the Democrats have been putting forth in the House. Really, that's Discriminate Against Christian Business Act, but allow the schools to be okay. And then finally, the Equality Act in Congress. I've had one lawyer say to me, if that's passed, it'll make traditional Christianity, biblical Christianity, illegal. So if that passes, if you vote and say it doesn't matter, if that passes, we'll be fine. He said you're going to go from trying to defend religious liberty through legislation in D.C. Well, you've already lost that. Now you're going to have lawyers on staff because you're going to be in litigation almost immediately all across the country. Wow. So, I hear people say we don't want to get into politics. Fine, I'm with you. Politics isn't going to save us. And even if we have, good, by the way, good politics can't save them. It can't deal with the matters of the heart. It just can't. That's why in the Christian worldview, it's the lesser, it's God's penultimate work. It's the basement floor work of God to preserve the world. It's never going to save us. So even good politics won't ultimately save us. It's not, but bad politics can really destroy. And so we're just trying to mitigate bad politics as much as we can. But you need to understand this. You're going to have to be able to defend your teaching, the moral teachings of the Scripture. You're going to have to be able to defend it, because there's groups of people now coming up saying those things can't even be said in our culture. So again, right now, one way to do this is just defend your right to teach the Bible. That's the First Amendment right. That's the religious liberty right. That's what we're doing in Washington, D.C., and we're not even talking about what we actually teach. We're saying, no, that's your job to preach and teach publicly those things. But if we lose that battle, then it'll be defend your right to say the things of the Scripture in every church, in every neighborhood, in every city across the country. So again, secularist strategy, if you want to talk about what the secularism strategy is, and I think whether it's just secularism, libertinism, and the homosexual agenda is part of that, the sexual orientation agenda is a part of that. It's first of all to educate Christianity out of existence. It's to defame it and desecrate it in the public square. Make fun of it. I mean, do you see the late night comics? They're so political now. Do you see them making fun of the secular progressive ideology at all? I mean, I heard Nancy Pelosi got caught going into a beauty shop with no mask on, and she did it kind of, and the whole point was they're telling us we're going to wear masks all over the place. We're going to have $500 fines, $1,000 fines. But here she comes in. She demands that the place open up for her, and she walks in without a mask. That's elitism. That's what it is, And someday we're going to have our rules for these sliver of people, the supremacist people, and then the rest of the rules for everybody else to keep us in line. But we're going to defame and desecrate anybody who speaks against that. And we're going to make fun of them as if they really don't know what they're talking about. And then finally, either through statutes, regulations, certifications, or legislation, litigate against the church and all of its ministries using hate crime legislation. So, I said, is this criminalizing spirit in our land? Back already in 1980, the Supreme Court ordered public schools to take down the Ten Commandments because kids might read, venerate, respect, and even obey them. Yeah, the criminalizing spirit is in our land. That's one of the reasons why we're for school choice. I mean, I'm not going to fight this issue about prayer in public schools or right now, the curriculum debate is owned by a certain group of people. It's going to be tough for parents to fight that back. But if you take your education money and go someplace else, that'll change things. That's one of the reasons I'm a big proponent of that, as well as I think it's the best thing for our urban schools and for the urban plight that a lot of families are struggling with. It'll be a great blessing to be able to take that money and get a good education wherever they go. But then there was this public school teacher in Houston that called the Ten Commandments hate speech. That was a while back, but it's in this book if you want to get this book, The Criminalization of Christianity. And then another another teacher at the same school caught two girls for bringing their Bibles to school. They were brought to the principal. The principal threw the Bibles in the trash and said, this is garbage. So it's not just a religion-free zone. It's now hostile to religion. So again, this is all about changing the society's norms. Again, the whole hate speech stuff, it comes from a false narrative. Even the whole bullying curriculum comes from a false narrative. It's meant to get different. It's meant to get different norms and different mores into our society through the education system. Again, just quoting some of the folks that are talking about this. Here was a gal. She talked about the agenda, and she said, the Christian, where is it here? She said, we want to change society's norms. She said, all We want the repeal of all legislative provisions that restrict the sex or number of provisions entering into the marriage unit. We want the extension of legal benefits to all persons who cohabitate, regardless of sex and numbers. Why? Because American view of marriage is inextricably connected to Christianity. So to destroy the nuclear family or the extended family through kind of moms, dads, and children, to destroy that is part of the agenda. And so it's not just give us the same honor due, it's actually destroy that notion that such a family institution actually exists. So these are the kind of things that we're up against, and there is a criminalization going on, and it's already starting in the sexualization of our children and education. We've talked about that before. The gay agenda is being offered at all levels of education. Contraception, abortion, all those things are being talked about in a certain way so that kids are actually desensitized to it. And the expression of religious-based concerns regarding homosexuality or libertinism or sex outside of marriage, all of those things will be considered hate speech if this kind of legislation is put forth. And some of this stuff was already back in the Gay Pride agenda back in April 25th, 1993. So, wow. That's kind of where we're at today. And so the question is what? So I asked those questions. Is Christianity the biggest threat to civilization? The answer is no. It's exactly the opposite of that. It's secular pietism, like we've been talking about. It's secular progressivism that arrogantly believes in the perfectibility of humanity without God, that fails to understand the real issues in the human heart. That's why this structural sin versus personal sin is, again, kind of a euphemism. I don't have a problem with that. Some structures can be sinful or systemically racist. The Jim Crow laws were that, but they were abolished. But this notion that somehow that's worse than individual personal sin and personal sin acted out in community, no. And so again, I think it's that new discussion is taking us into a different realm of, well, what's the solution? And the solution is we restructure ourselves. Well, that foolishly believes that structural change will lead to utopian ends. And listen, you got plenty of data on this. There's more history of bloodshed and violence connected with any ism, socialism and communism, than any other ism. And please don't give me the Crusades. Let's talk about what the Crusades were. They were a response to an invasion. They were not just people saying, let's go and wreak havoc around the world. So again, as we look at this kind of thing, again, more technology, more money, better structure equals salvation? No. Christians, you have a viewpoint on this. No, God's moral preservation, which even though it doesn't save us, it can bring the best in terms of our civility, justice, freedom, liberty, all of those things. If we acknowledge God's moral law and his moral ordering, his moral preservation of humanity. And then we get to preach God's saving of us. Wow. And that motivates us to a whole different kind of humanness as we serve one another's by grace through faith in him. So that worldview has produced the most tolerant, successful, diverse, free society. It's a realistic view of humanity's inherent equal dignity as well as its equal depravity. And only in this worldview have we differentiated both the temporal realm and the eternal realm so that both do what they're called to do from God's point of view. By the way, separation of church and state is not, first of all, it should be the distinction or the differentiation of church and state. It's a Christian worldview. There is no such worldview in secularism, and there is no such worldview in other religious perspectives on things. Christianity is the only one that differentiated but said both are accountable to God and both have legitimate roles in our lives. So, shouldn't the government be secular and amoral? No. If you're going to even use that terminology, separation of church and state, it was to limit the state, not the church. And again, that was the whole point. So if you're talking about a secular state, okay, if you limit the state to very, 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 very narrow perspective in our lives, and you say that's all it's supposed to do, then I suppose You don't have to have a religious motivation to fill a pothole. Let's say we limited the state to filling potholes. Well, do you have to be Christian to fill a good pothole? No. But if you grant state absolute access to all parts of life, and then you say it's supposed to be secular, well, you're wrong. The founding fathers would have never agreed to that because they wanted individual citizens to be free, and they wanted them to be self-disciplined, and they wanted them to be religiously motivated citizens. So it's nonsense to say that that's what they wanted. So again, the problem today is state encroachment, and we need to fight for our First Amendment protection and responsibility to push back on that. And finally, isn't that what separation of church and state is all about? No. James Madison wrote this. He talks about the excellence of a system by due distinction to which the genius and courage of Luther, Martin Luther, led the way between what is due Caesar and what is due God. We would say actually Jesus is the one that created this, not Luther just, again, told people about Jesus. He said that due diligence, distinction between Caesar and what's due God, promotes the discharge of both obligation best. The experience of the United States is a happy disproof of the error so long rooted in unenlightened mind of well-meaning Christians as well as others with corrupt hearts that without a legal incorporation of religion and civil polity, neither can be supported. A mutual independence is found most friendly to practical religion, to social harmony, and political prosperity. What did he just say? He said, you have to have a legally instituted institution called the church to actually push back on the abuses of government, or government will take over everything and you will lose liberty in the process. That's what it was about. Legal church institution, legal state institution, both are necessary for individual liberty to thrive and strive. So, I say our perspective is American life is about relentlessly limiting the government and expanding virtuous citizenship, and Christians can help in that. We can boldly speak about God's preserving work through families, industrious work, free enterprise, with an overarching view of the sanctity of life. We can speak about healthy vocations that strive for excellence to give God glory and to serve neighbor. We can talk about a healthy, limited government to keep rules fair for all, equal access for all, equal justice under the law, and we can limit the most egregious outward sinful behavior of those among us. Rioting is never a way to accomplish the things of civility. So, finally, speak without fear. The whole point of all this is that we can speak freely without fear of coercion to the limits of what government can do about the big things in life and the unlimited power of the gospel of Jesus to do what we cannot. So I hope that helps when you think these things through. Those who are trying to criminalize and literally privatize Christianity, there's a nefarious bent to that, and we've got to push back on that so that they can even hear the gospel of Jesus Christ too. So that they can also hear the limits of what state can do, the limits of what technology can do, the limits of what human beings can do. Because we not only have dignity, but we have an inherent depravity that always gets in our way. So please keep us in your prayers as we try to get this message out, as we try to undergird the church and God's people to be bold about these things, because we have a message to share that we want everyone to hear. For their sake as well. Thanks for the emails. Keep sharing our Liberty Alerts. Keep sharing our website. Please join us on the Word for the Center, things that for your Monday devotion and Friday op-ed. But till we see Jesus face to face, speak the truth in love with humility and grace. Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Until next time, God richly bless you. Have a great day.